Today on the podcast, I have Douglas Vigliotti. Douglas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So, you've got a new book out, Aristotle for Novelists. What came first for you in terms of interest? Was it writer's craft and story, or was it philosophy and Aristotle?
It's an interesting question. So, I guess one might say they came at the same time. When I wanted to learn how to tell stories, write them down, write novels. I started doing, a lot of research on the topic, obviously, as one does when they first embark on that journey. And what I quickly found was that everything funneled back to Aristotle. And dramatic writers specifically utilize this material to write their stories for the screen and the stage for forever, really. And so when you read any of like the masters of craft in story, whether it's Robert McKee or even practitioners like David Mamet or Aaron Sorkin, all of this stuff references Aristotle's Poetics. So for me, it was a natural progression to just say, why am I reading secondary sources? Let's go straight to the real thing. And so I doubled down on Poetics, read it multiple translations multiple times, and then it just was nagging me to write this book, and it took years for me to come around to actually do it, and then I did it, and I'm excited to share it with the world.
So, when I teach writing, I often reference Aristotle just as the kind of starting point for writer's craft because he was the guy who said we need a beginning and a middle and an end. And but that's no, kind of where I stopped talking about Aristotle. But obviously, looking at your book, it goes so much deeper than just beginning, middle, and end. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think beginning, middle, and end is a great starting point. It's in direct reference, or at least how like to think of it, in three act structure. So, you have the beginning, which is informs the middle, and the middle informs the end. And so it's everything is of consequence of each other, cause and effect. And that's only 50% of a working Aristotelian plot. So Aristotle says that a plot must contain a the first element being a change in fortune in your protagonist, so a protagonist that goes from good to bad or bad to good. The second piece being a connected series, a sequence of events, so your beginning, middle, and end, or your three act structure, your cause and effect, chain of causality. If we're looking at it in a macro concept, we say three act structure. If we're looking at it in a micro concept, we're looking at chain of causality. So actually, what is this scene causing the next scene? That type of thing. So you have the change in fortune in the protagonist. You have a connected sequence of events, and then A needs to come from B. So the change in fortune has to be derived from the sequence of events or the chain of causality or three act. And so everything really devolves from that. And yes, beginning, middle, and end is an essential starting piece, and it's an important one, but there is, as you've mentioned, a lot more that makes up what an Aristotelian plot would be.
I before I got my master's in English literature, I studied cinema. And I remember I was a young person sitting in the classroom and the professor was like, "And here is the film where they invented the close-up." I was like, "What?" They're like, "Yeah, no one ever thought of moving the camera closer before." And it's funny, people just assume something like, oh yeah, a story has a beginning and a middle and an end. You just assume that's always been there. But it takes someone like Aristotle to actually articulate that and set that foundation for everything that comes afterwards.
Well, I think, that while that is extremely important, I think that the first piece in a change in fortune in your protagonist is actually probably the more important piece, right? Like, because if you look at every story has most every story, let's call it 99% of stories, has a protagonist who wants something and they have obstacles standing in their way. And those obstacles are either external and internal. And so, how that interplays with your beginning, middle, and end, or your three act structure, or your chain of causality, your connected sequence of events is really the story, right? So, the story is super interesting when a protagonist is trying to beat the external obstacle, the antagonist, the weather, the mom, the dad, the parents. But it's even more interesting when we're seeing them battle their internal obstacles. And that is, that change in fortune, it really comes from the protagonist either overcoming their flaw or in a tragedy, they succumb to it, right? So in an Aristotelian tragedy, the flaw becomes fatal. So, ambition becomes obsession, or, it's a fine line. And we see this all the time in modern storytelling where, you, the protagonist, we see these both of these. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here because in the book I talk about Aristotelian comedies and Aristotelian tragedies, and we see both in a modern sense. Even though I'm using ancient language, examples are plenty and all over the place, both in novels and in movies, in both of these styles of story. Either one though. So look, in a tragedy, either in a tragedy or a comedy, the thing that is consistent is that there is a protagonist that wants something and there is something standing in their way and they're trying to battle obstacles, whether they're internal or external. The only difference between a comedy and a tragedy is that in a tragedy, they succumb to those obstacles. And in a comedy, they overcome. And 90% of stories are comedic because we want to see triumph. We want to see, the character overcome their obstacles and battle through these things. But in a tragedy, the reason why it works isn't because they overcome. We know that they don't overcome. It's because, or according to Aristotle, it provides a cathartic experience for the audience. We see the truth get unveiled. So we know that something is wrong and we watch. It's like Romeo and Juliet. It's a tragedy, but we know we're okay with it because we know passionate love can't sustain itself. And we know that we know that this is going to be their demise. Or a classic novel that I share a lot with people is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And that is a classic tragic novel because in it, we know that all humans die. And by the end, although the protagonist, the dad dies, we're okay with it. And now we have to watch the boy go and live his life without his dad. But that's a truth about life. So we're okay with that, even though it's a tragedy and the dad doesn't overcome his obstacles, and he ends up worse off. We're okay with it. Those are few and far between, though, because most of the time we want to see that character overcome, and almost, like I said, 90% of stories are probably comedic in their nature. I'm sorry if I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but I hope that kind of pulls things together a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's all. I mean, this is my jam, man. I can talk about this stuff all day. I was listening to an interview recently with someone who worked very closely with George Lucas, and he said that something George Lucas explained to him is that a lot of people get Star Wars wrong because they think it's science fiction. And George Lucas says, this isn't science fiction, this is myth. And then George Lucas defines myth as uh, truth wrapped in a story. And I think that's what you're getting at here in terms of when we're looking at a tragedy, the cathartic experience is going, yeah, that's truth. That's what life is like. And seeing that the essential understanding that like life isn't always great.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see it think of movies like Wall Street, right? With Bud Fox. So Bud Fox, he has to get to this ultimate high of making all this money, but we're okay seeing his downfall. Why are we okay? Because that, we know that people like that should get caught. They need to get caught. Like we're not upset about that. We're watching the story unfold and it's cathartic for us because we're like, oof. It's like almost tragedies are like the way to think about them is it's like a headache. And then when it subsides, it feels good.
Yeah.
That's basically what tragic stories are like. It's like we have this headache, and Aristotle says the more pity and the more fear that you can cause, the more cathartic the experience is going to be.
Absolutely.
So most of the time when I'm talking about this with people, and I say like, if you if you have a problem with the ending of a tragedy, it's more likely that it's not the ending that's your problem, it's how we got there. It's like we didn't do a good enough job getting there, not because ultimately you have to decide as the author of your story whether your protagonist is going to overcome their obstacles or succumb to their obstacles. And if you decided that they're going to succumb to their obstacles, that means there's a lot of stuff you have to do in that beginning, middle, and end to deliver on that ending when they eventually fall. And it's a tragic ending, right? And if you don't do that, it's not going to have that shape that is necessary to provide that emotional resonance. That's something that I actually talk quite a bit about in the book. The first principle in Aristotle for Novelists is novels are tragedy or comedy, and I talk about the essential nature of the things that we're discussing. It's important that the listener understands that in poetics, Aristotle only wrote about tragedies. So he didn't write about comedies. The reason why he didn't write about comedies is because the second part on comedies was actually lost. So he at the end of Poetics, he says, "And now I am going to speak on comedies," and we don't have it. It's gone forever. And there's only been 31 works of Aristotle's that have been recovered out of the 200 that he wrote. So there's a lot of missing work. The reason why we know all this about comedies and tragedies because we have a lot of other masters of craft who have then extrapolated on these ideas and pulled this stuff together. So we can talk about both of them pretty confidently, I guess you could say.
So you probably know in the world of writers, especially beginner writers or aspiring authors, there's this divide between plotters and pantsers. How might this book help a plotter or a pantser?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the very unique things about these principles is it's not a framework. Like, this is not a template. So, if the writer writes a working story, and I'm using air quotes, whether they know it or not, most of the time, these principles will reveal themselves. And so, whether you choose to plot your story or pants your story, you can always look back on your story and see if you know, is it a tragedy or is it a comedy? And have like you can always apply these principles. And actually, one of the things that Aristotle says in Poetics is that an unreflective writer, and this is the terminology he used, can experience the same techne as a reflective writer. Techne is a Greek term for skill, art. So basically, and I kind of butchered that there, but basically what he's saying is that an unreflective writer can have the same experience as a reflective writer, even if they don't know it. And the translator of the Penguin Classics edition, I think it was, what's his name? Thomas Cleary? No, maybe that's, of course, it's escaping me now. It's noted in the book. He says that he echoes this idea, basically saying that even the naive can, people who don't know what they are, that they are applying these principles, they may even have better manual dexterity than the people who do know these principles. It's just that they're inherent in what they're doing and they've learned it, they've self-taught, but no matter what, they're there. And when I say principles, neither Aristotle or any of the translators of any of Poetics, they don't talk about this in terms of principles. This work specifically, Aristotle for Novelists, is an adaptation where I took them and made them into principles for writers. So it's not like I want to be clear, I'm not citing them directly when I'm talking about the principles.
Sure, well, novels did exist when Aristotle was writing
This
poetics,
is
right?
true. This is true. This is true. This is true.
So we've talked a bit about plot and in structure and causality and whatnot, but let's return to character for a moment. I understand that Aristotle writes about four characteristics of a character. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So in Aristotle for Novelists, the principle number 13 is novels should contain true characters. And it's important that listeners or writers understand what Aristotle means by true. It is not true as in fact and fiction. It's true as in true to that character. And so, is it something the character would do? Is it probable? Is it likely? Is it needed? Is it necessary? All those words are words that Aristotle repeatedly uses throughout poetics because it's always about believability. It's always about, is this being true to the character? And when he talks about the four characteristics are one, goodness, not good like, is the character good? It's the character is good if their actions are good. Not what they say, not what they think, actions. If their actions are good, then they are good. Two would be appropriateness. And that appropriateness is directly related to the principle, trueness. How true is it your character? Are they appropriate, right? Are they acting appropriately? Not appropriately like good or bad, like based on how they would actually act, or are we forcing ourselves upon this character? The third would be relatability. This ties in another piece, an Aristotelian idea around imitation. So, are they imitating the qualities that are emblematic in human beings? So are they showing imperfections? Are they showing flaws? Are they imitating life? Aristotle says there are um, two reasons why storytelling, like humans were drawn to storytelling, and that is imitation and rhythm. And imitation being we learn to live through imitating as kids, which is why storytelling is an imitation of life. And so our characters should imitate human qualities, human nature. That's what makes them relatable. That's what makes us like them. That's what makes us want to care about them. That's what makes us want to go on this journey with them. So relatability is a big piece. And then the final piece is consistency, which is its own principle, actually. But with characters, it's particularly important. And before I was just saying how actions characters are good if their actions are good. This actually applies to actions as well because even if a character is, and Aristotle says this in Poetics, if a character is by their nature inconsistent, they should be consistently inconsistent. And we
Hamlet.
see this all the time in novels or in stories. This is the unreliable narrator. But eventually, what happens with that unreliable narrator is their words and their thoughts don't line up with what they do. And so what they do still trumps that character. But all in all, the character should be consistent throughout the novel. Unless, of course, keep in mind as they change, as they grow. But those are the four qualities. So it's goodness, appropriateness, relatability, and consistency.
I noticed you used the word believability, several times in there. And there's a documentary about the making of Frozen 2, the Disney film. It's like a 7-part documentary on Disney Plus, and it's just fascinating because the writers really, really struggled to get that film made. But there's a moment where they're interviewing a Disney animator, and he said something that I thought was really profound. I think it really captures what Aristotle and yourself are talking about there is, and he said, here at Disney, we don't deal with realism, we deal with believability. Right. And I think that's what you're hitting on there, this consistency, this believability.
I love that because when we talk about believability, we're not talking about fact versus fiction. We're not talking about truth. We're talking, did you pull it off? Did you pull it off? And I don't want to be a little too cynical, but I will say that when I engage with any art, the two questions that I ask myself most of the time is one, do they leave me wanting more? And I know that that is a completely subjective question, but the second piece is, do I believe them? And if I believe them and they leave me wanting more, I'm a fan. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care if you're drawing ponies. If I'm down with it and I believe it and I'm buying what you're selling me, then I'm a fan. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we can go wrong as writers and as practitioners with the believability piece. But it's important to remember that you set the stage for your story early on in your novel in first act. You're the one who sets the parameters and the rules and the boundaries that you have to play inside. Now, once you set those boundaries and those rules and how this is going to go, it's up to you to stay inside those boundaries and those rules and how this is going to go and not come from outside and disrupt things like believability. But just to echo what you were saying and tie a bow on this, it's not just Aristotle. It's not just the directors of Frozen. It's not just you and I. Countless practitioners talk about the essential nature of believability. I just shared a recent episode on my podcast about a David Mamet book. And David Mamet says, he was a famous playwright, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, screenwriter. He says, the audience will accept anything they are not given reason to disbelieve.
Mm, love it.
And I find that, I mean, I've heard Tom Petty echo that. I've heard Bob Dylan echo stuff like that. Believability is, it's the underpinning of the thing that you are doing. It's like and it's not something that could be easily defined as the fact and fiction. It's just once this person opens their mouth, once they set the course for what they are doing, the aesthetic, the vibe, are they pulling it off? Are we pulling this thing off?
You mentioned your podcast. Let's make sure we give folks the title so that they can check it out. What's the podcast?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I have a podcast called Books for Men, and it's a podcast to inspire more men to read. Every Monday, I'll share a book, not flipping back and forth from fiction to nonfiction, and just sharing, some of my big takeaways, what the book is about, a little bit about the author, and really, it's just bite-size episodes every Monday that are designed to engage, people, men, in reading more. And it's not. I want to be clear. These books aren't books that are, I think, that are only meant for men. The angle of the podcast is just to inspire more men to read. I think that these are books. The whole thing is, I'm a man. I enjoy this book. If you're a man, you might enjoy it too. And for the record, I have tons of female listeners because I hear from them all the time, and they're always like, "Why do you call this show Books for Men?" And I'm like, I just do it because I think that there's a void there that I want to try to address and I want to try to bring some attention to. And if I can do that and inspire even one other guy to pick up a book and read, then I'm a happy camper. And most people would say, because most men that read don't think it's an issue, but it's sort of an open secret in publishing that men don't read. Even if you're in even if you're around a group of guys, I would challenge you to ask them what they are reading, and you would be surprised that probably 9 out of 10 aren't reading anything. And they'll tell you that, I don't really read, or I should read more, or I want to read more. And if they are, most of the time it's nonfiction, not fiction. I think the statistic is 1 out of every 5 people that buy a novel is a man. So only 20% of novels are purchased by men. Um, and I mean, the statistics are just, they're there, but we don't have to go over them right now. I'm kind of going on a tangent on this.
No, it's funny. You and I were connecting on hockey before we hit record here. When I published my first novel, yeah, I told my hockey team about it, and one of the guys on my team, they bought the book from me, and they said, "Kevin, I've never read a book before, but I'm going to give yours a shot." So it's true. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. Uh, so I'm a big proponent of story planning and getting people to do some thinking about their books before they get going. In Aristotle for Novelists, you talk about three big questions that writers need to answer in order to write their story. Can you tell us a bit about those three questions?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So Aristotle is pretty specific that there's three things that writers need to grab a hold of when they're telling their story. And he calls them medium, object, and mode. And so medium, as I look at how this pertains to the novelist, medium would be the style and structure of your story. So stylistically, how do you want to tell your story? Structurally, how are you going to tell your story? Not necessarily internally, but it's more how are you going to what is the layout of this novel going to be? And so if you're a novel reader or a fiction reader, you know that there's countless ways that you can arrange the external layout of a novel, even if it's got a solid like internal working 3 act structure. And too I don't want to go too far off on the beaten path on that, but medium would be style and structure. Object would be what characters are necessary to tell this story other than your protagonist. And then specifically mode would be for the writer, for the novelist, what is the narration? What point of view are you utilizing and what tense are you telling this story in? And having a handle on all of these questions before you start is a probably a really good idea. Otherwise your novel could get quite messy, during the construction of it. Obviously, we don't have to unless you want to go into, more detail on point of view and tense and stuff, but it is worth it to note that just like everything in the novel, Aristotle thinks that consistency is important. And so this is why having a hold on these things is really important. So you can maintain consistency of point of view, consistency of tense, consistency of the style, or the structure of how you're telling the story. And by the way, that doesn't mean that every chapter has to be the same point of view or every chapter has to be the same style. There's wonderful novels that switch. I've shared plenty of them on my podcast. I mean, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin that came out like a year ago. She switches to a second person point of view in the middle of the story, does a great job with that. But the thing that is like consistent is when they're in that part, the author, they're very consistent, right? So when they're in the part that they're telling the second, when they switch all of a sudden to second person for whatever reason in the chapter, that is really, really consistent, right? And then like if you're using like a first person point of view or a third person point of view, it's radically different in how you're going to tell the story, right? Like a first person brings it more intimate. Third person expands the perspective, but being more intimate and narrow isn't necessarily a bad thing, and expanding isn't necessarily a good thing. These are just choices that one would have to make. But as Aristotle reminds us, everything you do for your story should be in service of the story itself. So, what is best served for your story? I don't know what type of story you're telling. That's gonna change depending on the story that you're telling and what's gonna be best served for that story. But either way, you have to answer those questions. That's, I think, how we started this.
Something a lot of novelists worry about and writers in general is criticism and haters and people not liking your book and one-star reviews. And something you tackle in the book is Aristotle's approach to fair criticism of stories. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Aristotle says that a book can be criticized on 5 different qualities. You have impossibility, irrationality, contradiction, harmfulness, and artistic standards. So, impossibility, irrationality, contradiction relate to other principles that you would read about in this book, like novels should be believable, novels should be logical, novels should be cohesive. So, like contradiction, are you contradicting things that happened earlier in your novel? Fair criticism. Is what you're telling me irrational based on everything else that has come before it? It's breaking the chain of causality, breaking logic. Fair criticism. Is it impossible? Could this not possibly happen based on everything that I know about your story? Fair criticism. The fourth piece would be harmfulness. He's not talking about morally scrupulous people, and he's actually quite open in Poetics, saying that writers should not be held to the same moral standards as others in the writing of their stories. So that means you have to write the story that needs to be written to depict the story that needs to be told, right? But if you have depravity or brutality that is in your story, but is not necessary to the story, it's open for criticism. So it's got to be necessary to the story that you are telling. If it's there for shock value or what have you, then it's open for criticism. And then the last piece is artistic standards, right? And artistic standards is just breaking the norms, breaking the great, breaking grammatical norms, breaking societal norms. That's not saying you can't. It's just saying it's open for criticism at that point. And by the way, I love rule breakers and I love people who get risky with style and that are odd and are different and unique and challenge and push boundaries. But you have to realize that when you do that, you're open to criticism commercially or critically, however, if you don't pull it off or if people don't think you pull it off, it's going to be open for criticism. So those are what he means. And just to note on what you said to open that question, one of the things that I always try to inspire writers with, other writers with, and other artists with is that a review, whether it is professional or whether it is on Amazon or Goodreads or what have you, that is more of an indicator of the reviewer than it is of the review. I take my background, my experiences, my worldview into everything I read, everything I write, everything I watch. That's me. That's Kevin. That's whoever. Everybody's experience and the way they come at something is completely different. And so when I say I like this, that's more of a reflection on my taste than it is a reflection on the author's ability to craft a story. And so it's really important, I think, for writers to always remember that a review is more of a reflection on the reviewer than it is on their work. And I don't think it's a great idea to look at reviews and all that stuff all the time, although I completely understand and empathize with wanting to know what people think about you and wanting to know what people think about your work. I do the same thing. So I won't squabble with that, with that idea of, don't look at your stuff. But I realize that that's not always, don't look at reviews, but I realize that's not always practical. So I just say, remember that the review is more of a reflection of the reviewer than it is of the actual work that's being reviewed.
When we were talking about the three questions, I think mode the first one?
No, that was Medium.
Medium. So it got me thinking about the medium of this book. I'm curious, what's your academic background? And, a book about Aristotle, was there ever a consideration to make this an academic piece instead of a commercial piece? Because there's like that medium choice right there where you really easily could have gone a different direction with the approach to this material. Love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, sure, of course. So I don't, to answer your question squarely, I come at this purely from a practitioner standpoint. I am, um, depending on who's listening and depending on who is hears what I'm about to say, or I'm 100% self-taught. I am, I rely heavily on editors and people that I've worked with, books and other masters of craft that I've read. It was never really even in the cards at all for me to take this in an academic setting. The only reason why I wrote it is because this is how I learned. Like this is how I learned, and so this was bothering me that this didn't exist in the marketplace. There was a tons of you could read tons of craft books on writing by Stephen King, is a memoir, Bird by Bird by, Anne Lamott. I mean, tons. And then there's also books like Story by Robert McKee or Save the Cat is another big one, but there was never, but then when I would dive deeper into the people, like I said at the top of this episode, masters of craft, other practitioners who have written on story, David Mamet, Aaron Sorkin, all these, it would all come back to Aristotle. And so then I said, well, why isn't these principles have been utilized forever for dramatic writers? So, even to this day, I see all of these principles in the stories that are on Netflix or on Amazon or on all these. Why doesn't this exist in some capacity for the novelist to help them craft their stories, to help them, because that's how I did it. Like that, I didn't go to an MFA program. I don't have, I'm a business background. That was writing is a passion for me. Storytelling is a passion for me. And so this is all self-driven. It was never an academic pursuit for me. And so in my mind, it wasn't really even an option, fortunately, I was getting good feedback from a lot of other writers who I know as they read this, and they're like, dude, we've got to get this out into the world. Like it's powerful. And that was inspiring and enough for me to, want to get it out there.
Amazing. I mean, they say there's a couple. Well, obviously, there's lots of different types of learners, but have you heard the story where they're like, if a toaster breaks, there's kind of two types of people. One person will take the toaster apart and like figure out what's wrong, put it back together, and then there's the other people who will like go hire a technician to fix it. Right? I feel like you and I are those two, where like, you know, you would go in there and just figure out how to fix it, whereas I'm like, I would go take a course on Aristotle. It's like you were like, oh, obviously Aristotle's the starting point. I'm just going to go read this myself. Whereas I would instantly need to like go find an expert on Aristotle and get them to teach it to me. It's really interesting ways of coming
Yeah,
at education and problem solving and all of that.
100%. I don't think that there's any wrong way to do it.
No, no.
The one thing that I will say is that, and I'm a staunch believer in this, and it's applied itself in other aspects of my life too. And it's another thing that I've observed in a lot of other practitioners in a lot of different subspecialties of life. And that is interest is the driving force behind learning. So you sit two people down and force one of them to read poetics, or you sit down somebody who wants to dissect it and break it down because they're interested in it. I'm going to bet on the interested person all day than the person who has 17 degrees, all kinds of letters affixed to the end of their name, who are forced to sit down there and read it. They're not going to read it the same way. They're not going to articulate it the same way. And it all comes down to interest. And it's like that. And we talked about hockey. We talked about hockey before this started. And I heard Wayne Gretzky one time say in a documentary called In Search of Greatness, they asked him, what does it take for a hockey player to be great? Or they said, well, what made you great? And he said, when I was a kid, I would sit out in the backyard and I would shoot pucks into the back of it into a net for 3, 4 hours. And while kids were down playing basketball and riding their bikes, I was doing that. And it wasn't because someone told me to do it. It was because that's just what I wanted to do. And so if you don't want to do the thing that you're doing, you're never going to have a shot at being great at that thing. Like it's interest driven. You have to want to go in the backyard and shoot pucks for 3 to 4 hours. Now, I know that this is sounding completely egotistical because it's painting me in a light of I'm super interested in this subject matter. And I don't mean it in that way at all. I'm just trying to draw the correlation of how much interest actually affects the understanding and the importance of learning something and then ultimately being able to apply that thing. And I think that one of the things that writers get tripped up on a lot is that, we have workshops and we have critiques and we have all these voices of people telling us this is how you should do it. But in this book, I talk about how there's a difference between writing and story. And writing is a lot more subjective than story is. Story, there's a lot more objectivity. Like I said, go read a story. Go read any story. There's going to be a protagonist. They're going to want something, and they're either going to overcome or succumb to those obstacles. That could be Vladimir Nabokov, that could be Doug Vigliotti, that could be Kevin Johns. It doesn't matter. Now, Vladimir Nabokov is going to write like the one of the best stylists I've ever seen grace a page. That's entirely different. That's the writing piece. And the thing is with the writing is so much about rhythm and so much about voice and so much about there's so much art in it that it's very subjective and it's very hard for me to confidently tell any writer that they're not writing well, or they're not, but I can confidently tell somebody I don't think that story works because to me there's just a lot more objectivity to it, and I would say to any writer, especially with writing specifically, only allow the voices of people who understand what you are trying to do to talk to you about your work. Everybody else doesn't matter. I'm not a workshop person. I'm a one-on-one person. I need to know that you understand the vision that I have for what I'm trying to do. Not just like, where does the comma go? Where does the, period go? You can condense this. I offer a lot of shorthand questions in Aristotle for novelists that one can ask themselves about style because Aristotle has a lot of points that he makes on style. But perhaps there is none that is more important than just being you on the page, allowing you to come through. Style is your voice is the only thing you truly have. And people I've found it's hard to be unique because people want duplication. They see uniqueness as a weakness, not as a strength, especially in the publishing industry. They want books that are written like other books because they think they can sell them. They don't want a book that is unique. They want it unique, but they say that, but really what they want is duplication because they want to be able to sell that book. They want to be able to position that book. I look at it from the artist standpoint. I don't look at it from the commercial standpoint. And I say, embrace your uniqueness. That is the strength, right? That is the strength. And I'm sorry to go on kind of a rant here, but this is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about because I feel like there's a lot of advice givers, and I am using air quotes when I say advice givers, that confuse story and writing all the time. I think it's giving advice on writing is tricky. Giving advice on story it's also tricky, but it's not as tricky because there's so much similarity between stories. For me, I've always said writing, the thing that a writer needs is confidence. So whatever you have to do to give a writer confidence, that's it. Everything else we can handle at another time. We got to give that writer confidence. That's it.
So true. As an editor, I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I've said to a coaching client, "What did you mean by this?" And they'll go, "I don't know." It's like if they're not confident in what they're trying to communicate, it's 100% obvious to me as a reader. Like so often, if they're a little confused about the story, or they're a little confused about how to describe something or the importance of something, it's like I see it instantly. You could feel the confidence versus the ambiguity, using a term from your book, right there on the page.
So Aristotle is very specific when he talks about confidence. But actually, he talks about courage, and he talks about the necessity of courage. And this isn't in poetics. This is in Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about the virtue of courage, and he says, "Fear is expected." Well, I'm paraphrasing him, but it's fear is expected, confidence is required, and courage lies in the middle. So you have to expect that there's going to be fear, but you need confidence to have courage. And in my book, in Aristotle for Novelists, the 15th principle, which is not actually in the subtitle of the book, talks about courage and the necessity for writers to have courage. It's impossible to create good work if you are not courageous enough. And I specifically reference a quote by Alejandro Inarritu, the director. He says, "Have the courage to be disliked." That to me, it's so hard to do, but man, is it such good advice. Man, it's such good advice. It's like, and pulling in Aristotle, it's like to have the courage to be disliked. Fear is expected, but confidence is required. It's the table stakes.
Well, the book is Aristotle for Novelists. It comes out at the end of November. Where can folks go to learn more about you and the book?
Sure. So the easiest place for people to go check out more about the book is aristotlefornovelists.com. There'll be more about the book. There'll be links on where they can pick it up. There's also a fun little 10-question assessment that one can download to know if they have a working story based on Aristotelian principles. And all of that is available at aristotlefornovelists.com. And of course, for me, they can just go to my website, douglasvigliotti.com.
One last question for you, Douglas. Obviously, Aristotle wasn't writing a writer's craft book. He was writing a book for everyone. And so, just to wrap things up, can you tell me a little bit about how studying Aristotle has impacted not your writing, but your life?
Yeah, so dramatically. And I'll try to keep this short and I will tie it back to something that I started with. All stories are a protagonist, Doug Vigliotti, who wants something. I don't know, publish this book. And there are obstacles standing in his way. External, friends, noise, critics, Instagram, I don't know, all and internal obstacles. My neurotic brain, all kinds of things, right? I've got to overcome those obstacles to get what I want. Will it be a tragedy or will it be a comedy? I don't want things to turn out to be a tragedy. I really want them to be a comedy. And so when I look at this material, I can fit it into life stories just as much as I could fit it into stories on the page or on the screen. And I think that's what makes it so philosophical and so interesting. And in another book, perhaps somewhere down the line, I may take the same material and form it for the individual in their life. Because I think everything here, how true is the character? How true are you being? Is it something, there's all of these principles. If you place yourself in the shoes of the protagonist, it's life. It's what life is. And going back to what Aristotle said, one of the two reasons why storytelling existed was imitation or mimesis, as he calls it. And so it all jives together. It ends up being, wow, there is no holes here. Like this really does all fit together when you start looking at it through this lens. And so to answer your question, literally the whole entire thing has informed the way that I look at life and the way that I look at stories, and stories are life, right? So we tell ourselves I'll end it on a quote that Joan Didion wrote in one of her essays, and it was, we tell ourselves stories in order to live.
Doug, thanks so much for being on the show today.
I appreciate it, Kevin. It was a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.